For 35 years, I sacrificed everything for my 3 children. My career, my dreams, even my health. I poured every dollar into their elite educations and startup ventures. Then, when I lost my executive assistant position at 58, they labeled me dead weight and suggested I move into a subsidized senior home. What they never suspected was that behind my modest appearance, I secretly controlled the very corporation that had just acquired their tech startup. Sometimes life's greatest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria, we need to discuss your situation. My daughter, Rebecca's voice held that particular tone, the one she reserved for difficult conversations with clients who couldn't afford her legal services. I recognized it immediately because I had taught her that tone myself during her mock trial preparations in law school. Now, at 32, she was turning it on me. I sat at my kitchen table, still in my work clothes, a simple gray blazer over a white blouse, practical black pants, and the comfortable shoes I'd worn for decades of 12-hour workdays. My phone was on speaker as I sorted through the stack of bills before me. What situation would that be? I asked, though I already knew. My son Marcus's voice cut in. They had me on conference call. Mom, be realistic. You've been let go. At your age, finding comparable employment is unlikely. We need to talk about sustainable options for your future. I took a slow, deep breath. 2 weeks ago, after 15 years as executive assistant to Lawrence Blackwell, CEO of Meridian Investments, I had been informed my position was being eliminated in a corporate restructuring. The severance package was fair, but at 58, with no college degree and in an economy increasingly driven by younger, tech-savvy workers, my prospects were indeed limited. Still, I had expected at least a month of sympathy from my children before they started making arrangements for me. I appreciate the concern, I said carefully, but I'm exploring several opportunities. There's no need for immediate decisions. A third voice joined the call. My youngest, Alicia, always the most direct of my children. Mom, stop pretending. Your savings won't last 6 months with your mortgage. The severance is barely covering your medical bills from last year's surgery. We've talked it over and found a nice senior living facility that accepts subsidized residents. You could move in next month. The calm efficiency with which they had researched and selected a facility, without once asking my opinion, sent a chill through me. In their minds, I had already been categorized. No longer self-sufficient, no longer independent, no longer worthy of making my own choices. We've already submitted an application, Rebecca added, her voice softening into what she likely thought was compassion. Given your financial situation, you qualify for the reduced income program. You'd have a small private room, 3 meals daily, and basic medical supervision. I glanced around my modest home, the house where I had raised them after their father walked out, choosing his executive career and new family over child support payments. Every wall held memories, height marks tracked in pencil, graduation photos, the first dollar from Marcus's tech startup framed in the hallway. I'm not moving into assisted living, I said quietly but firmly, and I would appreciate you consulting me before making applications on my behalf in the future. There was a momentary silence before Marcus responded with unconcealed impatience. Mom, be reasonable. Your skills are outdated. Your resume hasn't been relevant since the 90s. The job market has moved on. It was remarkable how quickly my children, who owed their prestigious educations and starter homes to my decades of sacrifices, had relegated me to the status of burden once my earning potential diminished. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that my role as Lawrence Blackwell's assistant had been far more complex than answering phones and scheduling meetings. For 15 years, I had been his most trusted advisor, the architectural mind behind Meridian's most successful, acquisitions, and the silent partner who had doubled the firm's portfolio while Lawrence served as its charismatic public face. And last year, when Lawrence's health began to fail, he had executed the succession plan we had privately discussed for years. On paper, I now owned 51% of Meridian Investments through a complex structure of shell companies and trusts. My termination was simply the necessary public cover for my transition to silent majority owner, operating entirely behind the scenes as Lawrence had wished. But my children saw only what they had always seen: a mother who had sacrificed her ambitions to support theirs, a woman who worked long hours in a seemingly subordinate position, a parent who now represented a financial liability rather than an asset. "I understand your concerns," I said, interrupting their continuing lecture about fiscal responsibility. "But I need some time to sort things out on my own terms." "Time is precisely what you don't have," Alicia countered. "Your severance will run out, and then what? We all have our own financial obligations. Marcus and Eliza just had the baby. Rebecca's still paying off law school debt. I've got the mortgage on the condo you encouraged me to buy." The irony wasn't lost on me. The condo I had encouraged her to buy, with the $50,000 down payment I had provided, the law school debt I had reduced by paying half the tuition up front, the baby shower for my grandson where I had gifted them $10,000 toward a college fund. "We're not trying to be harsh," Rebecca added, her voice taking on the practiced sympathy she used with difficult clients. "But we need to be practical. The senior living facility is really the most sensible option given your limited resources." I closed my eyes briefly, a sudden wave of clarity washing over me. For decades, I had measured my worth by what I could provide for my children: financial support, emotional nurturing, practical assistance. I had defined success by their achievements rather than my own. And now, in their eyes, I had been reduced to a spreadsheet calculation: assets versus liabilities, with the liability column growing too large for comfort. "I'll consider your suggestion," I said finally, knowing I had no intention of doing so. "Let's talk again next week." After ending the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table, the stack of bills forgotten as I considered my next move. In 3 days, Meridian would announce its latest acquisition: TechVantage Solutions, the rising tech firm where Marcus had been working as development director for the past 2 years. The company my son believed would make him a millionaire before 40 was about to become a subsidiary of the corporation I now controlled. My phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence's private number. "Board papers signed. Announcement scheduled." For Tuesday. "Sure you want to remain anonymous?" I smiled slightly, typing back, "Positive. Time isn't right yet." The truth was, I had spent a lifetime being underestimated, by my ex-husband, by corporate executives, and now by my own children. There was a peculiar power in that position, one I had learned to leverage effectively. People reveal their true character when they believe you have nothing to offer them. I picked up the senior living facility brochure my children had helpfully emailed over. "Sunset Haven, affordable dignity for your golden years." The name alone spoke volumes about their perception of my future. Rather than anger, I felt a profound sadness mixed with resolve. The children I had raised had somehow developed the belief that human worth was tied directly to economic productivity. Somewhere along the way, despite my best intentions, they had absorbed the toxic message that people, even their own mother, became disposable once their financial contribution diminished. It was time for a lesson in true value, one they would never forget. I reached for my other phone, the secure line used only for Meridian business, and dialed my newly appointed CEO. "Diana? Victoria here. I'd like to make a few changes to the TechVantage acquisition announcement. Nothing major. Just a slight modification to the transition leadership team." As I outlined my plans, a sense of calm purpose settled over me. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from what we give our children, but from what we finally have the courage to withhold. My journey to becoming majority owner of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm began in the most unlikely place, a high school typing class in 1982. While my classmates viewed it as an easy elective, I saw it as my ticket to independence. By senior year, I could type 120 words per minute without a single error. That skill landed me a position as secretary at Blackwell & Associates, a modest financial consulting firm run by a brilliant but disorganized young analyst named Lawrence Blackwell. He had vision but lacked structure. I had organizational talent, but no formal business education. It was a partnership neither of us recognized as such at the time. "Victoria, do you have the Robertson portfolio?" Lawrence would call out, frantically searching through stacks of papers. "Second drawer, blue folder, tabbed by acquisition date," I'd reply without looking up from my typing. "And you have a lunch meeting with investor prospects in 20 minutes. Within 3 months, I had reorganized the entire filing system, implemented a client management protocol, and begun screening potential investments before they reached Lawrence's desk. He noticed. By year's end, my title changed to executive assistant, though my actual role had expanded far beyond administrative support. When I discovered I was pregnant with Rebecca, Lawrence was the first person I told outside my then-husband, Richard. "Congratulations," Lawrence said, genuinely pleased. "Take whatever time you need. Your job will be waiting." Richard's response had been markedly different. "This complicates things," he'd said, his focus immediately shifting to the financial implications rather than the miracle growing inside me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 years later came Marcus, and then Alicia just 14 months after that. By then, Blackwell & Associates had grown into Meridian Investments, with offices in 3 cities and a robust client portfolio. I had designed my work schedule around my children's needs, often bringing a portable typewriter home to finish reports after they were in bed. When Richard began spending more time networking and less time parenting, I compensated by becoming both mother and father to our children. I coached soccer teams, supervised homework, and negotiated reduced fees for enrichment activities by offering my organizational services to the providers. The divorce, when it finally came, surprised no one except perhaps Richard, who seemed genuinely shocked that I would disrupt our arrangement. "You're making a mistake," he warned, standing in our kitchen for the last time. "You'll never maintain this lifestyle on your own." My attorney, paid for secretly through the bonus Lawrence had insisted on after I structured a particularly profitable acquisition, ensured I kept the house. Richard, eager to start fresh with his pregnant girlfriend, signed the papers without contesting. What he didn't know was that I had been making strategic investments through Lawrence for years, building a modest portfolio that would help supplement my income. Nothing that would make me wealthy, but enough to create a cushion for emergencies. That cushion evaporated quickly with 3 growing children and no child support. Richard had engineered his finances to appear far less successful on paper than in reality, a tactic I recognized but couldn't afford to fight in court. "Mom, can I join the science camp this summer?" Marcus asked one evening, placing a brochure on the table beside my stack of bills. The cost was equivalent to 2 months of our mortgage. "Let me see what I can do," I said, already calculating which insurance payment could be deferred. The pattern established itself early. My children's needs came first, my own dreams deferred indefinitely. When Rebecca showed exceptional academic promise, I took on additional responsibilities at Meridian to afford the private high school that would prepare her for college. When Marcus developed his passion for programming, I found the money for a computer and coding classes. When Alicia discovered her talent for design, I ensured she had the materials and guidance to nurture it. Lawrence watched this unfold with quiet concern. Victoria, you're investing everything in their futures and nothing in your own, he observed over a rare lunch meeting. They're worth it, I replied simply. I want them to have opportunities I never did. And what about your opportunities? He pressed. You have a natural talent for this business. You understand market psychology better than half my senior advisors. I smiled but shook my head. My children need stability. Pursuing my own education or career advancement would mean less time with them during their formative years. What I didn't add was the fear that had taken root after Richard's departure, that any misstep, any financial instability on my part, could result in losing my children. That fear drove me to accept the safer path of supporting Lawrence rather than building my own visible success. Then let's take a different approach, Lawrence suggested. If you won't pursue formal credentials, at least let me compensate you properly for the work you're actually doing. That conversation led to our unusual arrangement. Publicly, I remained his executive assistant, but privately, I received performance-based compensation for the investment strategies I developed. The disparity between my public persona and private contribution grew as Meridian expanded. By the time my children reached college age, I had helped Lawrence build Meridian into a formidable presence in the financial sector. Our unique partnership operated on implicit trust. I stayed in the background, providing the analytical foundation for decisions he presented to the board and clients. The cut was impeccable, the fabric luxurious without being showy. I paired it with a deep burgundy blouse and the single indulgence I had allowed myself over the years. A pair of pearl earrings Lawrence had given me on our 20th work anniversary. These belonged to my grandmother, he had said, presenting the velvet box. A woman of remarkable intelligence who never received the recognition she deserved. They should belong to someone who would understand their true value. As I fastened them now, I thought about the countless boardroom meetings where I had sat quietly in the corner, taking notes while simultaneously analyzing the financial projections being discussed. How many times had I slipped Lawrence a discreet note that completely redirected the conversation? How many crucial deals had materialized from strategies I had outlined but he had presented? My phone chimed with a text from my daughter Rebecca. Did you look at the senior living application? They need your financial disclosure forms by Friday. I didn't respond. Another message followed moments later. Mom, this is important. Your stubbornness isn't helping anyone. The persistent pressure confirmed what I had already realized. My children had moved beyond concern into something more disturbing. They had decided what was best for me without my input, and now viewed my resistance as an inconvenience rather than an assertion of autonomy. I drove to Meridian's headquarters, parking in my usual spot in the general employee section rather than the executive garage I now had access to. Habits of invisibility die hard. In the lobby, I nodded to the security guards who had greeted me every morning for 15 years. Morning, Mrs. Hayes, said Tom, the head of security. Didn't expect to see you today. Thought you'd finished last week. Just tying up a few loose ends, I replied with a smile. Well, we miss you already. Place isn't the same without you keeping everyone in line. I took the executive elevator, a first, directly to the conference level where the announcement would take place. Diana Chen was waiting in the preparation room, reviewing her notes. At 42, she was the perfect face for Meridian's future. Harvard MBA, impeccable track record in investment strategy, and the kind of polished confidence that inspired trust in both clients and markets. She was also one of the few people who knew my true role in the company. Victoria, she said warmly, embracing me, you look formidable today. Are you sure about remaining in the background for this announcement? Quite sure, I confirmed. Though I'll be observing from the side room. I want to see Marcus's initial reaction to the acquisition before our private meeting. Diana nodded. The Tech Vantage team arrived early. They're in the small conference room down the hall. Your son seems particularly anxious. He's been checking his phone constantly and stepping out for calls. No doubt he was updating his sisters about my failure to engage with their assisted living plans. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. Let him be distracted. The announcement would be all the more shocking. The acquisition reveal followed the standard corporate choreography: Diana's poised introduction, the carefully worded press release emphasizing synergistic opportunities and market positioning, the strategic vision for integrating TechVantage's innovative technology with Meridian's established client base. I watched through the one-way glass as Marcus shifted from initial shock to calculation, his expression transforming as he processed the implications for his own career trajectory. TechVantage's CEO, Jordan Winters, maintained a diplomatic smile. That didn't reach his eyes. He had fought the acquisition, recognizing it would diminish his control, but the board and investors had outvoted him. Now he was performing his corporate duty while silently planning his exit strategy, a dynamic I had witnessed dozens of times from my unobtrusive corner positions. After the formal announcement, Diana smoothly directed the TechVantage leadership team toward the executive conference room for preliminary integration discussions. I took a different route, entering through the connected office that had once been Lawrence's and was now ostensibly Diana's, though she preferred working from the open corner office down the hall. When I stepped into the conference room, conversation halted abruptly. Marcus's expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment to something approaching panic. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Before I could respond, Jordan Winters stood and extended his hand with the automatic courtesy of a CEO acknowledging support staff. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it? You were Lawrence Blackwell's assistant, as I recall." "That's correct, Mr. Winters," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Marcus jumped in, clearly mortified. "Mom, this is a private executive meeting." "We should formalize your position," Lawrence suggested repeatedly as the years passed. "Make you officially part of the executive team." Each time I declined. "I prefer things as they are," I would say. The truth was more complicated. By then, my identity had become inextricably linked to my role as mother and provider. My children viewed me through a very specific lens: the dedicated mother who worked long hours in a supporting role to give them every advantage. I feared that changing that perception would somehow destabilize their sense of security and our family dynamic. It was a fateful choice that allowed my children to develop a fundamental misconception about my capabilities and contributions to both our family and the business world. They saw only my sacrifices, not my accomplishments. They measured my worth by the visible position I held, not the invisible influence I wielded. When Rebecca graduated from law school and immediately landed a position at a prestigious firm, she sent me a thank you note that revealed volumes. "Thanks for all your sacrifices, Mom. I promise they weren't in vain." As though my life had been merely a stepping stone for hers, my value measured only in what she had become. When Marcus's tech startup secured its first round of significant funding, he called excitedly, "Can you believe it, Mom? All those years watching you struggle finally paid off. I'll never have to live like that." Their perception of my life as something to escape rather than build upon cut deeper than they could know. The professional respect I had earned behind closed doors at Meridian stood in stark contrast to the subtle condescension my children increasingly displayed as their own careers flourished. Last year, when Lawrence received his diagnosis, he called me to his home office, a space where we had made countless strategic decisions over decades. "Victoria," he said without preamble, "I have pancreatic cancer, 6 months, maybe less." The news devastated me on both personal and professional levels. Lawrence was more than my employer. He was my closest friend, the one person who truly saw and valued my capabilities. "We need to discuss succession," he continued with characteristic directness. "The board expects me to name Jeffrey or Michael as my replacement." Jeffrey and Michael were capable executives, but neither possessed the strategic vision that had built Meridian. "They would be logical choices," I acknowledged carefully. Lawrence smiled faintly. Logical, perhaps. Right? No. He slid a document across the desk. This is my proposal. I want you to take controlling interest through a carefully structured holding company. Publicly, we'll transition leadership to Diana Chen. She has the presence and skills to be the face of Meridian. Privately, strategic direction will come from you. The document outlined a brilliant succession strategy that would transfer true control to me while maintaining the public perception of conventional corporate leadership. Why not make this official? I asked. Put me in the CEO position directly? Lawrence's expression softened. Because you've spent 30 years building this peculiar invisibility, Victoria. I respect that choice, even if I've never fully understood it. This arrangement honors your preference while ensuring Meridian's continued success under your guidance. I signed the papers that day, becoming the silent owner of a company valued at over $6 billion, while maintaining the public persona of the loyal executive assistant who would soon be made redundant in the transition. As I sat in my kitchen now, finalizing plans for the TechVantage acquisition announcement, I wondered what my children would think if they knew the truth. That their mother, whom they now viewed as a financial burden requiring assisted living, actually controlled the corporate fate of thousands of employees, including Marcus himself. The lesson I was about to deliver wasn't about revenge. It was about perception, value, and the dangerous arrogance of judging others based on appearances rather than substance. I dialed Diana's number again. One more thing about the announcement. I'd like to schedule a private meeting with the TechVantage leadership team immediately afterward. And Diana, please make sure my son Marcus is in attendance. The morning of the acquisition announcement, I stood in front of my closet deliberating over my wardrobe with unusual care. For decades, I had cultivated a specific professional appearance, understated, practical, deliberately unremarkable. My wardrobe consisted primarily of mid-range department store basics in neutral colors, clothes that allowed me to fade into the background of executive meetings while the real players commanded attention. Today called for something different. I selected a tailored charcoal suit I had purchased but never worn, an impulse buy from the day Lawrence had informed me of the succession plan. I'm sure Diana's assistant can help you with whatever you need. Diana, who had just entered behind me, raised an eyebrow. Actually, Marcus, this meeting was called at your mother's request. The confusion in the room was palpable. Jordan. Winters frowned, looking between Diana and me with growing suspicion. I don't understand. Why would a former executive assistant be involved in acquisition integration discussions? Because Mrs. Hayes isn't a former executive assistant? Diana stated calmly. At least, that's not her primary role at Meridian. Marcus let out an uncomfortable laugh. There must be some misunderstanding. My mother was Lawrence Blackwell's secretary for years. She was let go during the recent restructuring. I took my seat at the head of the table, Lawrence's old position, and placed my portfolio on the polished surface before me. Marcus, I said quietly, you of all people should know the danger of making assumptions based on incomplete information. His face flushed. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering directly, I turned to Diana. Would you mind giving us the room? I'd like to speak with the TechVantage team privately. Diana nodded and exited smoothly, closing the door behind her. Mrs. Hayes, Jordan began, his tone a mixture of confusion and irritation. With all due respect, I'm not sure what's happening here, but we were expecting to meet with Meridian's executive leadership to discuss integration strategy. And you are, I replied, opening my portfolio and removing a document which I slid across the table to him. This might clarify the situation. Jordan scanned the paper, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock. He looked up sharply. This indicates you're the majority shareholder of Meridian Investments, that you control 51% of the company through. He glanced back at the document. Hayes Global Holdings. Marcus's head snapped toward Jordan. What? That's impossible. My mother doesn't even have a retirement account. That's not entirely accurate, I said calmly, meeting my son's gaze. I've simply been selective about what aspects of my financial situation I've shared with you and your sisters. Jordan was still processing the document. According to this, you've been the strategic director behind most of Meridian's major acquisitions for the past decade, operating behind Lawrence Blackwell's public leadership. Correct, I confirmed. Lawrence and I found it more effective for me to work without the visibility and scrutiny that comes with an executive title. Marcus was staring at me as though I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. This doesn't make any sense. If you're actually what this document suggests. Why have you been living in that modest house, driving a 10-year-old car? Why haven't you told us? His questions revealed so much about his worldview, the automatic assumption that wealth should immediately translate to visible consumption, that success without display was incomprehensible. I've had different priorities, I said simply, and different metrics for measuring success and satisfaction. Jordan, ever the pragmatic CEO, was already adapting to this new reality. So you're the one who orchestrated the TechVantage acquisition? You're the actual decision-maker we should have been negotiating with? Yes, I acknowledged. Though Diana Chen is absolutely authorized to execute the integration strategy we've developed. She's not merely a figurehead, she's an exceptional executive in her own right. Marcus seemed unable to reconcile the mother he thought he knew, with the powerful businesswoman being revealed. But you were just Dad's secretary when you met. You never even finished college. The dismissive tone, the automatic diminishment of my capabilities based on formal credentials, perfectly echoed the assumptions that had allowed me to operate so effectively for decades. People consistently underestimated what I could comprehend, influence, and achieve. Formal education isn't the only path to expertise, Marcus, I said quietly. I've spent 35 years analyzing market trends, investment strategies, and corporate acquisitions. I've negotiated deals worth billions while being mistaken for the person who merely arranged the meeting rooms. Being underestimated can be a remarkable strategic advantage. Jordan was watching this exchange with the sharp assessment of someone recalculating every assumption. I think I'm beginning to understand why TechVantage's resistance to acquisition suddenly collapsed last month. Those counteroffers that addressed our exact concerns, those came from you, didn't they? I nodded. I've been studying your company for nearly 2 years, Mr. Winters. Your technology is exceptional, but your financial structure was increasingly vulnerable. The acquisition terms were designed to preserve what makes TechVantage valuable while addressing the weaknesses that would have eventually undermined it. Marcus was now alternating between staring at me and checking his phone, which had been buzzing incessantly with messages, no doubt from his sisters, wondering why he wasn't responding to their texts about my situation. If you'll excuse me for a moment, he said stiffly, rising from his chair. I need to make a quick call. Actually, Marcus, I think your sisters can wait, I said firmly. This meeting directly impacts your professional future, and you might want to give it your full attention. His face reddened. They're concerned about you, about your living situation now that you've lost your job. He glanced at Jordan, clearly embarrassed to be discussing family matters in front of his company's CEO. As you can see, I gestured to the documents on the table. I haven't lost my job at all. I've simply transitioned to a different role, one that happens to include controlling interest in the company that now owns TechVantage. The implications of this statement visibly dawned on Marcus. His mother, the woman he and his sisters had been planning to dispatch to a subsidized senior living facility, was now effectively his boss. The woman whose financial management skills he had questioned now controlled the corporate fate of the technology company he had staked his professional reputation on. Jordan Winters, with the adaptability that had made him a successful CEO, smoothly stepped into the awkward silence. Mrs. Hayes, I believe we should restart this discussion with a clearer understanding of roles and expectations. Perhaps you could outline your vision for TechVantage's integration with Meridian? I appreciated his professionalism, His immediate pivot to treating me as the authority in the room rather than the inconvenient mother of an uncomfortable executive. Thank you, Mr. Winters. I'd be happy to. I opened my portfolio again and removed a detailed integration plan I had developed over the previous months. As you'll see, I've structured this acquisition to preserve TechVantage's innovation culture, while strengthening its financial foundation. As I began outlining the strategic vision, I noticed Marcus watching me with new eyes, seeing for the first time the business acumen that had always been there, hidden behind the maternal role. He had pigeonholed me into the mother who had always been just a secretary, just a support person, was revealing herself as the architect of corporate strategies worth billions. It was a lesson in perception that would only deepen in the coming hours, as his sisters discovered the truth about the mother they had so fundamentally misjudged. The meeting with the TechVantage team lasted nearly 3 hours. I presented a comprehensive integration strategy that protected the company's innovative culture while addressing its financial vulnerabilities, a balance that had eluded Jordan Winters despite his considerable talents. The other executives, initially skeptical, gradually shifted from polite attention to genuine engagement as the sophistication of the plan became apparent. Throughout, Marcus remained uncharacteristically silent, his expression cycling between disbelief, confusion, and what I recognized as a dawning realization of the professional and personal implications of his discovery. This woman, his mother, whom he had dismissed as financially naive and professionally irrelevant, was now revealing herself as a strategic powerhouse who had been operating behind the scenes for decades. As the meeting concluded, Jordan Winters extended his hand, his demeanor transformed from earlier condescension to unmistakable respect. Mrs. Hayes, I confess I had serious reservations about this acquisition. Your strategy addresses concerns I hadn't even articulated publicly. I look forward to working with you directly moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Winters. Diana will be your primary contact for day-to-day matters, but my door is always open for substantive discussion. I gathered my materials, aware of Marcus's eyes tracking my every movement with newfound wariness. Mom, he said quietly as the other executives filed out. We need to talk. Yes, we do, I agreed. But not here. Come to my house for dinner tonight. Bring your sisters. I checked my watch. 7 o'clock, don't be late. I left him standing in the conference room, his phone already in hand, no doubt preparing to deliver news that would upend his sister's perceptions as thoroughly as his own had been shattered. Back in Lawrence's former office, my office now, though I rarely used it, Diana was waiting with a satisfied smile. How did it go? Exactly as expected, I replied, settling into the leather chair that had always seemed too imposing for my taste. Jordan Winters is pragmatic enough to adapt. Quickly, the other executives will follow his lead. And Marcus? Processing, I said simply. I've invited him and his sisters to dinner tonight. That should be illuminating. Diana nodded thoughtfully. Victoria, may I offer an observation? Speaking as someone who knows what it means to be consistently underestimated. Of course. Don't let anger drive what happens next. Not because your children don't deserve a reality check, they clearly do, but because anger diminishes your power in their eyes. It makes your actions seem emotional rather than strategic. I considered her words carefully. Diana had faced her own battles as an Asian American woman in finance, her brilliance repeatedly attributed to diligence rather than genuine insight. She understood the unique frustration of having one's capabilities dismissed. You're right, I acknowledged. This isn't about punishment. It's about correction. After finishing several pressing matters at the office, I drove home to prepare for the evening's confrontation. I had just parked in my driveway when my phone rang. Rebecca, finally breaking her texting pattern to make an actual call. Mom, she began without preamble, her lawyer voice in full effect. Marcus just told us something completely unbelievable. He claims you're secretly the majority owner of Meridian Investments? That you orchestrated the Tech Vantage acquisition? You need to explain what's going on immediately. The demand in her tone, the automatic assumption that I owed her an explanation on her timeline, perfectly encapsulated the dynamic I was now dismantling. "I'll explain everything tonight at dinner," I replied calmly. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. "Mom, I have a client meeting until 6:30 downtown. I can't possibly—" "Reschedule it," I interrupted, using the same authoritative tone I'd heard her employ countless times. "This is more important." A beat of silence, then. Are you serious about this Meridian situation? Because if this is some kind of misunderstanding— 7 o'clock, Rebecca. I'll see you then." I ended the call. Inside, I changed from my business attire into comfortable slacks and a cashmere sweater, one of the few luxury items I'd allowed myself over the years. I kept it simple but elegant, deliberately avoiding both the frumpy practicality my children associated with me and the ostentatious display they might now expect. At precisely 6:58 p.m., 3 cars pulled into my driveway in quick succession. My children had never been this punctual for a family dinner in their adult lives. The power of curiosity and anxiety. They entered in birth order, Rebecca first, her legal portfolio clutched like a shield. Marcus next, his expression guarded. Alicia last, her artistic temperament evident in the searching gaze that took in my slightly altered appearance. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the dining room table where I'd arranged a simple but elegant meal. "We have much to discuss." "Mom," Rebecca began immediately, "before we get sidetracked, I need to understand what Marcus told us. He claims you're some kind of silent corporate executive? That you secretly own Meridian Investments? Obviously, there's been a misunderstanding." I poured wine for each of them, taking my time. "No misunderstanding, Rebecca. I am the majority shareholder of Meridian Investments through a holding company I established last year. I've been the principal strategic architect of the firm's major acquisitions for the past 15 years, working behind Lawrence Blackwell's public leadership." "That's—" She searched for words. Her legal training momentarily deserting her. "That's not possible. You've been living here, in this modest house, driving that old Honda, wearing clothes from department stores. If you had that kind of wealth and position, why would you live like this?" Her question echoed Marcus's earlier bewilderment. The automatic equation of success with conspicuous consumption, the inability to comprehend power that doesn't announce itself through external trappings. "Because I wanted to," I said simply. "Because material display has never been my metric for success. Because I found it more effective to operate without the scrutiny that comes with visible wealth and power." Alicia, always the most intuitive of my children, was watching me closely. "You're not joking, are you? This is real." Her voice held a note of wonder, rather than disbelief. I reached for the portfolio I'd placed beside my chair and removed 3 document sets, sliding one toward each of them. "These are the legal filings establishing Hayes Global Holdings as the controlling entity of Meridian Investments, along with the corporate restructuring documents that formalized my transition from executive assistant to majority owner following Lawrence's death." Rebecca, in full lawyer mode now, immediately began scanning the papers, her trained eye looking for loopholes or inconsistencies. Marcus stared at his copy without touching it, as though it might burn him. Alicia opened hers and began reading slowly, deliberately. "This is legitimate," Rebecca finally acknowledged, looking up with genuine shock. "But Mom, this would mean you're worth approximately $3.2 billion as of this morning's market valuation," I supplied calmly, "though much of that is tied to Meridian's corporate holdings rather than liquid assets." The silence that followed was profound. 3 adult children confronting not just the revelation of their mother's hidden wealth, but the complete dismantling of the narrative they had constructed about her capabilities, her choices, and her future. Marcus found his voice first. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years we thought you were struggling, sacrificing everything just to give us opportunities. We thought you needed our help, our protection." "Did I ever ask for your protection?" I inquired quietly. "Did I ever indicate that I viewed my life choices as a struggle rather than a deliberate strategy?" "But you worked as a secretary," Alicia protested. "You took orders, arranged meetings, answered phones. We saw it when we visited your office." "I performed those functions, yes," I acknowledged. "And simultaneously, I analyzed acquisition targets, developed investment strategies, and shaped corporate policy, all while being underestimated by everyone around me except Lawrence himself." Rebecca had regained her composure, her legal mind now fully engaged. "These documents indicate Lawrence transferred controlling interest to you just 6 months before his death. Was there any coercion involved? Any undue influence given his medical condition?" The question might have seemed offensive coming from anyone else. From my daughter, the corporate litigator, it was simply professional thoroughness. "Lawrence and I discussed this succession plan for years," I explained. "The timing was accelerated by his diagnosis, but the strategy was long established. Diana Chen was selected as the public face of leadership specifically because she understands and supports my preference for operating behind the scenes." "But why?" Marcus pressed. "Why hide this from us? Did you think we couldn't handle knowing our mother was actually a corporate power player? That we'd somehow be damaged by knowing you were successful?" His question penetrated deeper than he realized, touching on fears I'd carried for decades about how my children would respond to a more assertive, professionally visible mother. "Initially, it was practical," I explained. "When you were young, I needed stability and security. Operating publicly would have involved risks I wasn't willing to take while you were dependent on me. Later, it became apparent that my invisibility was actually an advantage. People reveal more, assume less, and underestimate consistently when they believe you're merely support staff." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But I also observed something concerning as you grew into adults. All 3 of you began measuring success in increasingly narrow terms: prestigious titles, visible wealth, status markers. You developed a troubling tendency to dismiss people you perceived as occupying lesser roles. Their expressions revealed this had struck home. They knew it was true. 3 days ago," I continued, "the 3 of you held a conference call to inform me, not ask me, inform me, that I should move into a subsidized senior living facility because my job loss made me, in your estimation, unable to support myself. You had already submitted an application on my behalf, without my knowledge or consent." The reminder visibly discomforted them. Rebecca shifted in her seat. Marcus stared at his plate. Alicia had the grace to look genuinely ashamed. "We were concerned," Rebecca said, her voice lacking its usual conviction. "We wanted to ensure you had stability." "No," I corrected gently but firmly. "You wanted to solve what you perceived as the problem of an aging mother with limited financial resources. You made assumptions about my capabilities, my finances, and my future based on incomplete information and your own biases about what constitutes success and security." I lifted my wine glass, taking a careful sip before continuing. "The irony, of course, is that while you were planning my subsidized retirement, I was finalizing the acquisition of the company that employs your brother, a $420 million transaction that will significantly impact hundreds of employees and reshape an entire market sector." The contrast hung in the air between us, the gulf between their perception and reality now undeniably exposed. "So, what happens now?" Alicia asked quietly. "Where do we go from here?" It was the right question, the one that looked forward, rather than backward, that sought understanding rather than justification. That depends on what you learn from this revelation, I replied. This isn't about punishment or retribution. It's about recognition of false assumptions, of invisible contributions, of value that exists beyond titles and visible trappings of success. I looked at each of them in turn. Rebecca, whose legal brilliance I had always admired despite her growing rigidity. Marcus, whose technological creativity reminded me of my own unconventional thinking. Alicia, whose artistic sensitivity made her simultaneously the most vulnerable and most perceptive of my children. You've each achieved success in your chosen fields, I acknowledged. But somewhere along the way, you developed a dangerous blindness, the inability to recognize worth in those who don't announce their value in ways you've been conditioned to respect. That blindness led you to fundamentally misjudge your own. Mother, I wonder how many others you've similarly dismissed. The question lingered as we began our meal. 3 successful adults confronting a humbling truth. They had failed to see the extraordinary in what they had categorized as ordinary, had missed the power and brilliance concealed behind a deliberately modest exterior. It was a lesson with implications far beyond our family dinner, a reminder that true value rarely announces itself with trumpets, and that those who lead with their titles have often achieved far less than those who quietly transform. They're corners of the world without seeking recognition or applause. D to make a quick call. Actually, Marcus, I think your sisters can wait, I said firmly. This meeting directly impacts your professional future, and you might want to give it your full attention. His face reddened. They're concerned about you. About your living situation now that you've lost your job. He glanced at Jordan, clearly embarrassed to be discussing family matters in front of his company's CEO. As you can see, I gestured to the documents on the table. I haven't lost my job at all. I've simply transitioned to a different role, one that happens to include controlling interest in the company that now owns TechVantage. The implications of this statement visibly dawned on Marcus. His mother, the woman he and his sisters had been planning to dispatch to a subsidized senior living facility, was now effectively his boss. The woman whose financial management skills he had questioned now controlled the corporate fate of the technology company he had staked his professional reputation on. Jordan Winters, with the adaptability that had made him a successful CEO, smoothly stepped into the awkward silence. Mrs. Hayes, I believe we should restart this discussion with a clearer understanding of roles and expectations. Perhaps you could outline your vision for TechVantage's integration with Meridian. I appreciated his professionalism, his immediate pivot to treating me as the authority in the room rather than the inconvenient mother of an uncomfortable executive. Thank you, Mr. Winters. I'd be happy to. I opened my portfolio again and removed a detailed integration plan I had developed over the previous months. As you'll see, I've structured this acquisition to preserve TechVantage's innovation culture while strengthening its financial foundation. As I began outlining the strategic vision, I noticed Marcus watching me with new eyes, seeing for the first time the business acumen that had always been there, hidden behind the maternal role he had pigeonholed me into. The mother who had always been just a secretary, just a support person, was revealing herself as the architect of corporate strategies worth billions. It was a lesson in perception that would only deepen in the coming hours as his sisters discovered the truth about the mother they had so fundamentally misjudged. The revelation dinner shifted something fundamental in my relationship with my children. As they left that evening, subdued, thoughtful, still processing, I recognized that we stood at a crossroads. The comfortable patterns that had defined our interactions for decades had been irrevocably disrupted. What would emerge in their place remained uncertain. Rebecca was the first to reach out the following morning, her text message uncharacteristically tentative. Mom, can we talk? Just the two of us? I have some questions. We arranged to meet for lunch at Emerson's, an upscale restaurant downtown where Rebecca often entertained clients. Her choice of venue was revealing, a place where she felt confident, established, respected. She was seeking solid ground after having hers thoroughly shaken. I arrived deliberately early, taking a moment to observe my eldest daughter as she approached the restaurant. Rebecca had always carried herself with precision, her posture, her attire, her every gesture calculated to convey competence and authority. Today was no different on the surface, yet I noted subtle signs of uncertainty in the slight hesitation before she entered, the extra moment she took to compose herself before approaching the table. "Mom," she greeted me, leaning down for our customary cheek kiss. "Thank you for meeting me." An interesting shift, thanking me for my time, acknowledging that my schedule might have value. After ordering, Rebecca folded her hands on the table, her expression carefully neutral. "I did some additional research after our dinner. Your position at Meridian is quite extraordinary. The holding company structure is particularly elegant. It provides significant tax advantages while maintaining operational flexibility. Always the lawyer, approaching even personal revelations through the lens of technical assessment. Lawrence and I designed it together," I acknowledged. "We had complementary strengths, his expertise in market strategy, my talent for organizational architecture." Rebecca nodded, a flash of genuine admiration crossing her features. "The arrangement with Diana Chen is especially innovative. Few companies successfully implement that kind of dual leadership structure." "It works because it's authentic," I explained. "Diana genuinely excels at external representation and day-to-day operations. She doesn't resent operating in partnership with someone who prefers to remain in the background." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, tracing the rim of her water glass. "That's what I can't quite reconcile," she finally said. "You've achieved this remarkable position, this extraordinary level of influence and success, yet you've deliberately chosen to remain invisible, to live modestly, to let others, even your own children, underestimate you. Why?" Her question was sincere, reflecting genuine bewilderment rather than challenge. For Rebecca, whose career had been built on visible achievement, whose sense of self was intimately connected to professional recognition, my choices were incomprehensible. "Success isn't universal," I said carefully. "What constitutes achievement for one person may feel like failure to another. I've never measured my worth by titles, public recognition, or material accumulation." "But you could have had all those things," she pressed. "You could have been recognized as a pioneering female executive. You could have been profiled in business magazines, given commencement speeches at universities, been a visible role model." "I could have," I acknowledged. "And for some women, that visibility is crucial, breaking barriers publicly so others can follow. But that was never my calling. I found I could actually accomplish more by working behind the scenes, by being consistently underestimated." Our food arrived, providing a natural pause in the conversation. I watched as Rebecca methodically organized her salad, a habit she'd had since childhood, grouping ingredients, creating order before beginning. "There's something I need to ask," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "When we suggested the senior living facility, when we assumed you couldn't manage financially, were you testing us? Was this all some elaborate lesson? About assumptions and respect?" I set down my fork, meeting her gaze directly. "No, Rebecca. I didn't orchestrate my termination or the acquisition timing to teach you a lesson. Those business decisions were made for legitimate strategic reasons. But when you and your siblings immediately jumped to categorizing me as a financial burden without asking meaningful questions about my plans or preferences, it revealed something important about how you've come to view me, about how you measure human worth." She flinched slightly, but didn't look away. "We were concerned about you." "Were you?" I asked gently. "Or were you concerned about the problem I might present? About the potential inconvenience of a mother with limited resources?" Her silence acknowledged the truth. Rebecca, you're a brilliant attorney. You've built an impressive career by questioning assumptions, by digging beneath surface presentations to find underlying realities. Yet with your own mother, you accepted the most superficial assessment, that a woman without a prestigious title or visible wealth must be financially vulnerable and professionally irrelevant. She pushed her salad away, her appetite apparently gone. You're right. And it's not just about you. I've realized I do this constantly, making snap judgments about people based on their job titles, their educational credentials, their visible markers of success. She looked up, her expression troubled. Yesterday, I actually caught myself dismissing an insight from our paralegal because she's just a paralegal. Even though she's been with the firm longer than I have, and probably understands our clients better than most of the partners. This self-awareness surprised me. Rebecca had always been resistant to criticism, quick to defend her perspectives rather than examine them. That recognition is valuable, I said, more valuable than you might realize. But how do I change it? She asked. And I heard the genuine question beneath, not just about her professional assessments, but about our relationship. How do I stop seeing the world through these limiting filters? Start by questioning your automatic categorizations, I suggested. When you find yourself thinking someone is just a secretary, or just a paralegal, or just a stay-at-home parent, pause and consider what assumptions you're making about their capabilities, their choices, their worth. She nodded slowly. I've been thinking about something you said at dinner, about how people reveal more when they believe you're merely support staff. That's actually brilliant strategy. While everyone's focused on impressing the person with the fancy title, you're quietly gathering information, seeing people as they truly are. Exactly, I confirmed. People perform for those they perceive as powerful. They show their authentic selves to those they consider irrelevant. A thoughtful expression crossed Rebecca's face. Is that why you never corrected us? Why you let us believe you were struggling financially all these years? Were you observing who we really are? The question cut close to fears I'd harbored for decades, that revealing my true professional standing would somehow alter my children's authentic development, that they might perform for my wealth rather than relate to me as their mother. Partially, I admitted. But it was more complex than that. I wanted you all to develop your own ambitions, your own definitions of success, without reference to mine. I feared that if you saw me primarily as a corporate power player, it might influence your own path choices, either to emulate me or deliberately diverge from my example. So you let us believe you were just an executive assistant, she said, softly. A dedicated mother who sacrificed her own opportunities for her children. That narrative wasn't false, I pointed out. I was an executive assistant. I did prioritize your stability and opportunities. I simply had a parallel professional, reality that I chose not to emphasize. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing. You know, she finally said, I've spent my entire adult life trying to avoid what I perceived as your limitations. The modest home, the practical car, the careful budgeting. I've pursued visible success, prestigious connections, material comfort. I've measured my worth by how far I could get from where you seemed to be. The admission held both regret and revelation. And now? I prompted. Now I'm wondering if I've been chasing the wrong metrics entirely, she said quietly. If I've been so focused on appearing successful that I've missed opportunities for more meaningful impact. If I've prioritized being recognized over being effective. It was a profound moment of self-reflection, one I hadn't anticipated. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps eventual acceptance, but not this immediate willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions. It's never too late to incorporate new metrics, I offered. To expand your definition of success beyond the visible markers you've been pursuing. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. I've been approached about joining the board of a legal aid nonprofit. I've always declined, citing time constraints. But the truth is, I didn't think it was prestigious enough. It wouldn't elevate my profile in the right circles. She looked at me with new clarity. That's exactly the kind of thinking that led me to misunderstand you so completely, isn't it? Self-awareness is the first step toward change, I said. The question is what you'll do with that awareness moving forward. As our lunch concluded, Rebecca reached across the table to squeeze my hand, a rare gesture of physical affection from my normally reserved daughter. I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for the senior living facility suggestion, but for underestimating you for so long. For missing who you really are because I was too focused on superficial measures of success. Thank you, I said simply, though I should acknowledge that I deliberately cultivated that underestimation. It served my purposes professionally to be overlooked. A smile tugged at her lips. Still, most people would have revealed their true position the moment their children started making patronizing suggestions about their financial future. Most people haven't spent 30 years practicing strategic patience, I replied with a matching smile. As we walked out of the restaurant together, Rebecca paused. There's one thing I still don't understand. Now that Lawrence is gone, now that you've established the holding company and positioned Diana as the public face of leadership, why maintain the invisibility? Why not step into the light of your accomplishments? It was a fair question, one I had been considering myself in recent months. Perhaps it's time for a measured shift, I acknowledged. Not a complete reversal. I have no interest in becoming a public figure, but a selective visibility in contexts where it might serve purposes beyond my own satisfaction. Rebecca's expression brightened with sudden understanding. Like mentoring young women who might benefit from your unique perspective on leadership, or advising organizations that promote alternative paths to corporate influence. Precisely, I confirmed. Invisibility has served me well, but it has its limitations. There are certain insights that can only be shared through direct connection. As we prepared to part ways in front of the restaurant, Rebecca hesitated. Would you be willing to have lunch again next week? I'd like to understand more about how you structured those early acquisitions at Meridian. The strategic approach you described at dinner was fascinating. The request reflected a new dimension in our relationship, professional respect layered with personal reconnection. For the first time, my daughter was seeing me not just as her mother, but as a business strategist whose insights might have value for her own career. I'd like that, I said sincerely. Walking back to my car, I reflected on our conversation with cautious optimism. One lunch couldn't erase decades of misperception, but it represented a beginning, an opportunity to build a more authentic relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed limitations. The revelation of my true professional standing had created an unexpected opening, not just for my children to see me more accurately, but for me to step beyond the rigid boundaries I had established around my own identity. Perhaps it was time to explore the territory that existed between complete invisibility and conspicuous visibility, a middle path where strategic influence could be combined with selective mentorship. As I drove back to the office for an afternoon, meeting with Diana about the next phase of the TechVantage integration, I found myself contemplating Lawrence's words from our final conversation. You've spent 30 years building this peculiar invisibility, Victoria. I respect that choice, even if I've never fully understood it. Perhaps the time had come to evolve that choice, not to abandon it entirely, but to adapt it to this new chapter where being seen, in carefully chosen contexts, might create value, beyond what invisibility alone could accomplish. The unforeseen opportunity emerging from my children's miscalculation wasn't just a chance to correct their perception of me. It was an invitation to reconsider my own carefully constructed boundaries, to explore what might be possible if I selectively stepped out of the shadows I had so carefully cultivated. While my lunch with Rebecca had opened a pathway toward understanding, Marcus proved more difficult to reach. For 3 days following our revelation dinner, he remained conspicuously silent. No calls, no texts, not even the perfunctory check-ins that had been his pattern for years. Diana kept me updated on his performance at TechVantage, reporting that he was professional but withdrawn during integration meetings. "He's processing," she observed, recalibrating his entire understanding of his mother and, by extension, himself. On the 4th day, my doorbell rang at precisely 7 p.m. Marcus stood on my porch, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his usually meticulous appearance replaced by a rumpled dress shirt and jeans, his expression caught between determination and discomfort. "May I come in?" he asked formally, as though visiting a stranger's home rather than the house he'd grown up in. I stepped aside to welcome him, noting the stiffness in his posture as he entered. In the living room, he remained standing, hands in pockets, gaze moving restlessly across familiar surroundings that now seemed to hold new significance for him. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered. He shook his head. "I need to understand something, Mom. Something fundamental." "Go on." "My entire life, I've believed that your career limitations were the result of sacrifice, choosing motherhood over professional advancement, prioritizing our stability over your ambition." His words came carefully, precisely chosen. I built my own career partly in response to that narrative, determined to achieve the success you never pursued, to validate your sacrifices by becoming what you couldn't be. I remained silent, allowing him to articulate the realizations that had clearly been consuming him for days. "But that narrative was false," he continued, a hint of accusation entering his tone. "You weren't limited by circumstance or sacrifice. You were successfully operating at the highest levels of corporate strategy while deliberately maintaining the appearance of professional subordination. Which means, I prompted gently when he hesitated. "Which means I've been defining myself in opposition to a fiction." The admission seemed physically painful for him. "I've spent my adult life trying to become something my mother never was, only to discover she actually achieved far more than I've managed to accomplish, just without the public recognition." I gestured for him to sit, taking the chair opposite his. "Marcus, your accomplishments are legitimate and valuable. Your work at TechVantage has transformed how companies manage their digital security. That innovation exists regardless of your motivations for pursuing it." He finally sat, leaning forward with elbows on knees. "But don't you see? I've been so condescending, so patronizing. I've viewed your career choices with a mixture of pity and determination not to repeat them. I've practically patted myself on the back for outgrowing your limitations." He looked up, genuine anguish in his expression. "How could you let me be so wrong about you for so long?" The question cut to the heart of our relationship. The careful distance I had maintained between my maternal and professional identities, the deliberate compartmentalization that had served my strategic purposes, but created profound misconceptions for my children. "I made choices that felt right at each stage of our lives," I said carefully. "When you were young, my priority was creating stability after your father left. As you grew, I found that keeping my professional life separate allowed you to develop your own aspirations without reference to mine." "But at what cost?" he pressed. "Do you have any idea how many times I've explained to colleagues or friends that my mother was just an executive assistant? How many times I've framed your career as something to transcend rather than emulate?" His distress wasn't primarily about wounded pride, I realized. It was about confronting the gap between how he had presented me to the world and who I actually was. A disparity that now forced him to question not just his understanding of me, but his own self-narrative. "Marcus, we all create stories to Make sense of our lives and relationships, I said. Your perception of me wasn't completely wrong. I was an executive assistant. I did prioritize your well-being over public recognition. The error wasn't in seeing those aspects of my life, but in assuming they represented limitations rather than choices. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. But why maintain the facade? Why live in this modest house? Drive that practical car, skip vacations, when you could have afforded so much more? Was it some kind of test? Were you waiting to see if we'd value you without the trappings of success? No, I said simply. It wasn't a test. It was authenticity. The material markers of success have never motivated me. What has always driven me is the work itself, the intellectual challenge of crafting strategy, the satisfaction of building something substantial, the opportunity to operate effectively without the constraints that come with visibility. But everyone wants recognition, he countered. Everyone wants respect for their accomplishments. I had recognition and respect from the people whose opinions mattered professionally. Lawrence, Diana, the small circle of executives who understood. My actual role. Beyond that, public acknowledgement would have undermined my most effective strategy, being consistently underestimated. Marcus fell silent, considering this perspective that ran counter to everything he had absorbed in his own corporate climb, where visibility and credit were precious commodities to be aggressively pursued. The day of the acquisition announcement, he finally said. When you walked into that conference room and took your seat at the head of the table, Jordan Winters dismissed you instantly. I was embarrassed by your presence, worried you'd somehow diminish my professional standing. His voice dropped. And then, within minutes, you completely transformed the power dynamic. I've never seen anything like it. The way Winters went from condescension to respect without you raising your voice or making demands. I nodded, acknowledging his observation. That transition occurs when people realize they've fundamentally misjudged someone, when they must rapidly recalibrate not just their perception of that person, but their understanding of their own judgment. It was masterful, he admitted. And I realized that while I've been focused on acquiring the external trappings of corporate success, the title, the corner office, the recognition, you've been cultivating something far more powerful. The ability to shape outcomes regardless of your formal position. He looked up, a new awareness in his expression. That's actual power, isn't it? Not the kind that depends on others acknowledging it, but the kind that works whether people recognize it or not. It's one form of power, I confirmed, one that suited my temperament and circumstances. Marcus stood suddenly, pacing the living room as he had often done as a teenager working through a difficult problem. I've been so focused on appearing successful that I've missed opportunities to develop actual influence. I've prioritized who knows what I've accomplished over what I've actually managed to build. His self-recognition echoed Rebecca's, though, coming from a different angle, my pragmatic son identifying the strategic disadvantage of his visibility fixation rather than the moral implications Rebecca had focused on. There's value in visible leadership too, I reminded him. Different contexts call for different approaches. What matters is conscious choice rather than automatic adherence to conventional success markers. He stopped pacing, turning to face me directly. The integration meeting tomorrow, the one where we're finalizing TechVantage's new organizational structure. Will you be there? Do you think I should be? I countered, curious about his perspective now that his understanding had shifted. Yes, he said without hesitation. Not just because you own the company, but because your strategic insight is exceptional. The way you analyzed our strengths and vulnerabilities showed a deeper understanding of our technology applications than most of our own executive team possesses. I considered his request carefully. Under normal circumstances, I would have guided the integration through Diana and the transition team, maintaining my customary distance. But the circumstances had fundamentally changed, not just organizationally, but personally. I'll attend, I decided, though I'll need to consider how my visible involvement might affect the integration dynamics. Marcus nodded, relief evident in his expression. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A short, genuine sound. Of genuine amusement. Do you realize what's happening here? I came to demand explanations for why you let me believe a fiction about your career, and now I'm practically begging for your strategic input at my company. That's quite a reversal. Life rarely moves in linear progressions, I observed with a smile, especially when it comes to parent-child relationships. He sobered, looking at me with new eyes. Not just as his mother, not just as a surprising corporate power player, but as someone whose life choices contained wisdom he hadn't previously recognized. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not just for the senior living facility suggestion, though that was horrifically presumptuous, but for the years of condescension, for viewing your career choices as something to pity rather than understand. Apology accepted, I said simply. He hesitated, then asked the question that I sensed had been driving his visit. Can we start over somehow? Find a way to relate to each other that isn't built on misconceptions? We don't need to start over, I corrected gently. We just need to continue with greater awareness. You're still my son. I'm still your mother. We've just added new dimensions to our understanding of each other. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the modest living room where he had played as a child, where he had completed homework under my supervision, where he had announced his college acceptance and later his engagement. You know, he said thoughtfully, I always felt a bit embarrassed bringing friends here. The small house, the practical furniture, the absence of luxury items that my colleagues' parents displayed. I wanted my childhood home to impress people. He shook his head, a rueful smile forming. And now I realize this was actually a conscious choice, that you could have afforded far more, but deliberately chose this moderate lifestyle. This house has everything I need, I said simply. Comfort, functionality, memories. What would more square footage or designer furniture have added to my actual quality of life? He considered this, then nodded slowly. I spent $12,000 last year on a dining table that we've used exactly twice for actual meals. Eliza and I eat at the kitchen island while scrolling through our phones most nights. The admission carried a new self-awareness. We've been so busy acquiring the symbols of success that we've neglected to build the substance of a satisfying life. It was a profound realization for my achievement-oriented son, one I hadn't anticipated coming quite so quickly or clearly. It's never too late to realign your choices with your actual values rather than acquired expectations, I offered. The question is, what truly matters to you, beyond the external markers of success you've been pursuing? He didn't answer immediately, which told me the question had landed exactly as intended, not as a rebuke, but as an invitation to genuine self-examination. I don't know, he finally admitted, but I think it's time I figured that out. As I closed the door behind him, I felt a cautious optimism about this new phase in our relationship. Marcus had always been my most pragmatic child, quick to recognize strategic advantage once it became apparent. If he could translate his professional adaptability to personal growth, this revelation might catalyze meaningful change in how he measured success and value, both his own and others. The following morning, as I prepared for the integration meeting, my phone lit up with a text from Alicia, my youngest. Mom, can we talk? Not about the money or Meridian, about choices and authenticity, about finding your own definition of success when everyone around you is measuring with the wrong yardstick. I smiled, typing back immediately. Yes, how about dinner tonight? 3 children, 3 different reactions to having their fundamental assumptions overturned. Rebecca approaching it analytically, Marcus strategically, and Alicia, always my most intuitive child, going straight to the philosophical implications. As I gathered my materials for the meeting, I reflected on how differently this situation might have unfolded had I revealed my true professional standing years earlier. Would they have developed the same drive to establish their own identities if they had grown up in the shadow of my corporate success? Would they have chosen their current paths if they had understood the full scope of my capabilities and influence? These questions had no definitive answers. What mattered now was how we moved forward, not with recriminations about past misconceptions, but with a commitment to authentic connection based on who we actually were rather than who we had assumed each other to be. The moment of truth wasn't just about revealing my hidden success. It was about creating space for a new kind of relationship with my adult children, one built on mutual respect, genuine understanding, and the recognition that true value exists, far beyond visible titles or material displays. As I drove toward Meridian's headquarters for the integration meeting, I felt lighter than I had in years. The careful compartmentalization I had maintained for decades, necessary for my professional strategy but costly for my personal relationships, was finally giving way to a more integrated identity. Not a complete transformation from invisibility to visibility, but a thoughtful evolution towards selective authenticity in contexts where it could create meaningful value. Sometimes the most powerful moments of opportunity emerge not from careful planning, but from unexpected disruptions that force us to reconsider our most fundamental assumptions about others, about our circumstances, and ultimately about ourselves. The TechVantage integration meeting marked a turning point in my professional visibility. Seated at the conference table beside Diana, I watched the subtle shifts in body language as executives who had previously dismissed me now recalibrated. Their approach, eyes lingering a moment longer on my comments, postures straightening when I asked questions, responses becoming more precise and thoughtful. Marcus sat across from me, his expression neutral but attentive. In the 3 days since our conversation at my home, he had maintained a respectful professional distance, neither leveraging our relationship nor attempting to distance himself from it. It was a delicate balance, and I appreciated his navigation of this complex new dynamic. The cloud security protocol transition presents our most significant integration challenge, Jordan Winters was explaining, directing his comments primarily to Diana. Our clients have specific compliance requirements that might conflict with Meridian's standard approach. I made a small notation on my tablet. Actually, we've already anticipated this issue, I said, my voice measured but confident. If you'll reference Section 4 of the integration documents, you'll find we've outlined a phased compliance approach that maintains TechVantage's existing client protocols while gradually aligning with Meridian's broader security framework. Jordan blinked, clearly surprised that I had not only understood the technical concern, but had already developed a solution. I'll review that section more carefully, he acknowledged, a new note of respect entering his tone. As the meeting progressed, I contributed strategically, demonstrating my comprehensive understanding of both companies' operations without undermining Diana's leadership position. It was a careful recalibration of my usual approach, neither fully in the shadows nor aggressively claiming the spotlight. When the meeting concluded, several executives lingered, clearly hoping for an opportunity to establish a more direct connection with me. The shift was both amusing and instructive. These were the same individuals who had previously walked past my desk without a second glance, viewing me as part of the office infrastructure rather than a strategic decision-maker. Mrs. Hayes, ventured Carolyn Mendez, TechVantage's chief operating officer, I'd be interested in discussing your perspective on our Asian market expansion strategy when you have time. Your analysis of regional regulatory variations was remarkably insightful. I'd be happy to schedule that conversation, I replied. Perhaps next week? I'll have my assistant coordinate with yours. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had been the assistant others coordinated with. Now, I was referring to my own administrative support with the casual confidence of an executive who had never occupied the other role. As the room cleared, Marcus approached cautiously. "That went well," he observed, though I noticed at least 3 executives trying to reconcile their previous dismissal of you with your obvious expertise. Winters looked like he was mentally reviewing every condescending comment he ever made in your presence. I smiled slightly. People adapt quickly when power dynamics shift. The genuine test will be whether they learn the broader lesson about making assumptions based on titles and appearances. Speaking of appearances, Marcus hesitated, clearly choosing his next words carefully. Eliza wants to invite you to dinner. Tomorrow night. She's processing the revelations about your position at Meridian. I think she needs to see you in person to fully reconcile her previous perceptions with reality. Eliza had always been the most status-conscious of my children's partners, a corporate attorney from a wealthy family who measured value primarily through material markers and professional titles. Her relationship with Marcus had always struck me as a partnership of ambition more than deep connection, though I had been careful never to express this observation. "I'd be happy to join you for dinner," I said, curious about how my daughter-in-law would recalibrate her approach now that her understanding of my financial standing had been dramatically altered. The following evening, I arrived at Marcus and Eliza's modern lakefront home, a stunning glass and steel structure that had been featured in architectural magazines but always struck me as more showpiece than comfortable living space. I had visited infrequently, always conscious of the subtle cues that marked me as somehow not quite suitable for this pristine environment. The discreet glances at my practical shoes, the careful directions to use specific coasters under my water glass, the distinct feeling that my presence disrupted the carefully curated aesthetic. Tonight, however, the dynamic had already shifted before I even crossed the threshold. Eliza opened the door personally, rather than sending the housekeeper, her usual sleek confidence notably diminished. "Victoria," she greeted me, using my first name instead of the slightly distant Mrs. Hayes she had maintained for years. "Thank you so much for coming. Please, come in." The house had been transformed for the evening. Fresh flowers in the entryway, candles lit throughout the living area, the formal dining table set with their finest china rather than the casual kitchenware they typically used when I visited. These were the preparations one makes for an honored guest, not a familial obligation. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Eliza asked, her tone carrying an unfamiliar deference. "We have a lovely Barolo we've been saving for a special occasion." "Water would be fine for now," I replied, taking the seat offered in the living room with its panoramic lake view. "Perhaps wine with dinner." Marcus appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Mom, glad you made it. Dinner's almost ready." The domestic scene was unusual. Marcus cooking rather than their private chef, Eliza personally attending to hosting duties rather than orchestrating from a distance. They were making a concerted effort to present a more authentic, less status-driven encounter. "Eliza, have you had a chance to update your mother on Grandparents' Day at Caleb's school?" Marcus prompted, clearly attempting to establish a normal conversational rhythm. "Oh yes," Eliza replied, gathering herself. "Caleb's preschool is hosting a special day for grandparents next month. They'll be doing art projects together, having lunch, that sort of thing. We'd love for you to attend, if you're interested." The invitation was notably different from previous interactions regarding my grandson. Typically, my involvement had been carefully managed, scheduled visits when convenient, brief FaceTime calls, but rarely inclusion in school events or meaningful rituals. "I'd be delighted," I said simply. "Thank you for including me." Dinner progressed with a strained politeness, conversation limited to safe topics, Caleb's developmental milestones, the unusually warm weather, a neutral discussion of a recent art exhibition. The elephant in the room, my revealed financial and professional standing, remained unaddressed until dessert was served. "Victoria," Eliza finally ventured, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "I owe you an apology. When Marcus and I discussed your employment situation, I made assumptions that were clearly uninformed and, frankly, condescending. The admission clearly cost her something in pride. Eliza had built her identity around her discerning judgment, her ability to accurately assess people, situations, and opportunities. I appreciate your candor, I replied evenly. What I'm struggling to understand, she continued, her composure briefly faltering, is why you chose to live so modestly when you clearly had other options. Why maintain the appearance of financial limitation when you could have easily afforded a very different lifestyle? The question revealed so much about her worldview, the automatic assumption that financial capacity should immediately translate to visible consumption, that choosing not to display wealth represented either a peculiar eccentricity or a deliberate deception rather than a legitimate value system. Different people derive satisfaction from different sources, I explained. Material comfort beyond a certain threshold has never significantly increased my happiness or sense of fulfillment. I've always found more satisfaction in meaningful work, in developing strategic expertise, in watching my investments, both financial and personal, grow over time. Eliza nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she found this perspective difficult to fully comprehend. But surely you must have wanted some recognition for your accomplishments, the respect that comes with a visible leadership position. I had recognition from the people whose opinion mattered professionally, I pointed out, and respect takes many forms, not all of them attached to formal titles or public acknowledgement. A flicker of discomfort crossed her features as she undoubtedly recalled her own dismissive attitude toward me over the years. The subtle condescension when explaining basic financial concepts I understood far better than she did. The carefully managed invitations to their home. The polite but clear messaging that I didn't quite belong in their sophisticated social circle. I suppose what I'm really asking, she said finally, setting aside pretense, is whether you were testing us, whether you were deliberately concealing your financial position to see how we would treat you without the incentive of inheritance. The question revealed her fundamental framing of relationships as transactional. That behavior toward others should be calibrated based on potential gain rather than inherent value or genuine connection. No, Eliza, I said firmly. I wasn't conducting a test. I was living according to my values and preferences, which happened to differ from yours. Not everyone measures worth, their own or others, by material display or professional title. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What Mom means is that different people have different metrics for success and satisfaction. I understand what she means, Eliza replied, a hint of her characteristic sharpness returning. I'm simply trying to reconcile the Victoria Hayes who lives in a modest home and drives a 10-year-old Honda with the Victoria Hayes who apparently controls billions in corporate assets and orchestrated the acquisition of my husband's company. They're the same person, I said simply. The apparent contradiction exists only if you assume wealth must be visibly performed to be real. The conversation might have continued along this philosophical line had my phone not chimed with a distinctive tone, the secure line I used only for urgent Meridian matters. I excused myself to take the call in their foyer. Victoria, Diana's voice was tense. We have a situation developing. The Peterson Group is making aggressive moves toward a hostile takeover of TechVantage directly, attempting to circumvent our acquisition. That's not possible, I replied quickly. The acquisition is already legally finalized. They're claiming irregularities in the shareholder approval process. Their legal team has filed for an emergency injunction to halt integration activities pending review. It's almost certainly without merit, but it could significantly disrupt the transition if a judge grants even a temporary stay. I considered the implications quickly. The Peterson Group was a notoriously aggressive investment firm with a history of using legal maneuvers to force favorable deals. They had likely been planning their own acquisition of TechVantage before we secured it, and were now attempting to create enough uncertainty to either unravel our deal or force us to pay them to withdraw their challenge. Have Sanjay prepare a comprehensive response, I instructed, referring to our chief legal counsel, and schedule an emergency meeting with the board for 7 a.m. tomorrow. I'll be there in person. When I returned to the dining room, Marcus was instantly alert to the change in my demeanor. Is everything all right? A situation requiring attention, I said calmly, not wanting to create undue concern, particularly in front of Eliza, whose firm occasionally represented the Peterson Group in unrelated matters. Nothing that can't be managed, but I'll need to cut our evening short. Thank you for dinner. As Marcus walked me to the door, he kept his voice low. Is it about Tech Vantage? I saw an unusual number of calls from Peterson's legal team to our general counsel today. I appreciated his discretion and perceptiveness. Yes. We'll discuss it tomorrow at headquarters. 7:30 a.m. if you can make it. He nodded immediately. I'll be there. Driving home, I reflected on the evening's strained interactions with Eliza, her difficulty reconciling her previous dismissive assessment with my newly revealed standing, her struggle to understand choices that operated outside her value framework, her instinctive recalculation of my worth based on financial capacity rather than inherent qualities. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family was still processing the revelation of my true financial position, I was now facing a corporate challenge that threatened the very acquisition that had precipitated this disclosure. The Peterson Group's aggressive move represented the first significant test of my more visible leadership role at Meridian. A test observed not just by the board and executives, but now by my son as well. As I prepared for the following morning's emergency meeting, I considered how differently I might have approached this threat in my previous role, operating through Lawrence or remaining entirely behind the scenes. Now, with my ownership position acknowledged, my response would necessarily carry a different weight, be scrutinized through a different lens. The gathering storm, both within my family dynamics and in the corporate challenge before me, would require all the strategic patience and decisive action I had cultivated over decades. But unlike previous crises I had navigated, this one would unfold with my children bearing witness to my actual capabilities rather than the limited version of myself I had allowed them to see for so long. Perhaps this unexpected corporate battle would provide the most convincing demonstration of what I had been trying to explain to Eliza, that true power lies not in visible trappings or formal recognition, but in the capacity to shape outcomes through strategic insight and decisive action when circumstances demand it. Morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often accompanies pivotal moments. I dressed with deliberate care, a charcoal suit similar to the one I had worn for the acquisition announcement, but paired with a deep cobalt blouse that conveyed both authority and confidence. The pearls Lawrence had given me completed the EEI ensemble, a small reminder of the mentor who had recognized my capabilities long before anyone else. The Meridian boardroom was already filled when I arrived at 6:45 a.m. Diana stood at the head of the table, engaged in quiet conversation with Sanjay Mehta, our chief legal counsel. Board members and key executives clustered in small groups, their hushed discussions creating a low hum of tension. Marcus sat slightly apart, reviewing documents on his tablet with focused intensity. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table from Diana, a deliberate positioning that allowed us to maintain our complementary leadership dynamic. Conversations stilled as my presence registered, eyes shifting in my direction with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Let's begin, Diana announced, her voice calm but authoritative. As you've all been informed, the Peterson Group has filed for an emergency injunction to halt our integration with Tech Vantage, claiming irregularities in the shareholder approval process. She gestured to Sanjay. Our legal team has prepared an initial assessment. Sanjay, a brilliant attorney with decades of corporate litigation experience, addressed the room with characteristic precision. The Peterson Group's legal challenge is fundamentally without merit. Their claims of procedural irregularities are based on deliberately misinterpreted proxy documentation, and contrived statutory interpretations. Under normal circumstances, this would be dismissed relatively quickly. But these aren't normal circumstances, I observed, drawing all eyes to my end of the table. James Peterson has significant political connections, including with 2 judges who could potentially be assigned to this case. Sanjay nodded. Precisely. While the legal argument is weak, the procedural delay could be substantial if they secure a sympathetic hearing. During that period, TechVantage would remain in limbo, technically acquired but unable to fully integrate, which would create significant market uncertainty, Diana continued, potentially destabilizing TechVantage's client relationships and employee retention. Several key contracts come up for renewal during this period. The strategy was clear to anyone with experience in corporate acquisitions. The Peterson Group didn't expect to win the legal challenge. They merely needed to create enough uncertainty and potential damage to force Meridian into a settlement, likely selling them a significant portion of TechVantage at a favorable price to make the problem disappear. Marcus leaned forward. TechVantage's technology value is primarily in our engineering team. If this drags on, we risk losing key people to competitors who are already circling with aggressive recruitment offers. Exactly their calculation, I confirmed. This isn't about winning in court. It's about creating enough potential damage that settlement becomes the rational choice. One of the board members, Gregory Winters, cleared his throat. What are our options? Can we simply outspend them legally and wait it out? Sanjay shook his head. Even with unlimited legal resources, court calendars move at their own pace. We're looking at a minimum of 3 to 4 months before any definitive resolution, possibly longer if they secure the right judge. During that period, the injunction would significantly hamper integration activities. And what would Peterson want in a settlement? Another board member asked. Based on their past patterns, Diana replied, they'll demand a significant equity stake in TechVantage at well below market value, likely with special governance rights that would give them effective control over key decisions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Meridian had invested significant resources in the TechVantage acquisition, viewing its technological innovations as central to our long-term strategy. Ceding control to the Peterson Group would fundamentally undermine that vision. There is another option, I said quietly, drawing all attention back to me. One that addresses the immediate legal challenge while preserving our strategic objectives. I outlined a counter-strategy that had formed in my mind overnight, a deliberate restructuring of the acquisition terms that would render the Peterson Group's legal challenge moot, while actually strengthening Meridian's position. The approach was unorthodox, requiring a temporary financial sacrifice, but ultimately creating a more advantageous long-term arrangement. As I spoke, I was acutely aware of Marcus watching me with a mixture of professional assessment and personal revelation. This was the first time he was witnessing my strategic thinking applied to a high-stakes corporate challenge. Not as his mother, not as a former executive assistant, but as the controlling shareholder of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. When I finished, Diana was the first to respond. It's brilliant, she said simply. Legally sound and strategically superior to our original structure. The temporary financial impact is significant but manageable given our overall position. Sanjay nodded slowly. I'd need to review the specifics, but conceptually, this would indeed render their current legal challenge irrelevant. They'd have to completely restart their approach, which would cost them critical momentum. The board members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by both the substance of the strategy and the confidence with which I had presented it. Gregory Winters, who had initially seemed skeptical of my involvement, now regarded me with undisguised respect. I move that we authorize Mrs. Hayes and the executive team to implement this counter-strategy immediately, he proposed. The motion passed unanimously. As the meeting concluded, Marcus lingered, waiting until the room had cleared before approaching me. That was masterful, he said quietly. You didn't just solve the immediate problem, you've actually improved our long-term position. Sometimes the most effective response to an attack is to fundamentally change the terrain on which it's occurring, I replied. The Peterson Group expected conventional defensive maneuvers. By restructuring the entire acquisition framework, we've essentially changed the game they thought they were playing. Pride flickered briefly in his expression before being replaced by something more complex. I keep thinking about all the times I've explained business strategy to you over family dinners, simplifying concepts I assumed you wouldn't understand. He shook his head ruefully. All while you were operating at a level I haven't even approached in my career. Different contexts require different approaches, I said gently. Your work in technology innovation is exceptional. We each have our domains of expertise. He seemed about to say more when Diana returned to the boardroom, accompanied by Alicia, my youngest child, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the executive environment. Alicia? I said, surprised. I didn't expect to see you here. She arrived a few minutes ago, Diana explained. I thought you might want some privacy. She gestured toward Lawrence's former office. My office now, though I rarely used it. Take as much time as you need. I'll start implementing the counter-strategy with the legal team. As Diana departed, I led my children into the private office, closing the door behind us. Alicia stood awkwardly, taking in the expansive space with its panoramic views of the city skyline. So this is where you really work, she said softly. Not the desk outside Lawrence's office where I used to visit you. I only use this office occasionally, I explained. Most of my work still happens in less formal settings. Alicia moved to the window, staring out at the city below. Unlike her siblings, she had chosen a creative path, establishing herself as a respected graphic designer despite pressure from her father to pursue a more conventional career. Of my 3 children, she had always been the most intuitive, the most sensitive to undercurrents in relationships. I overheard the end of your meeting, she said, still facing the window. The way you dismantled that legal threat, it was like watching a chess grandmaster calmly rearrange the board to make the opponent's strategy irrelevant. Mom's been handling situations like this for decades, Marcus said, a new respect evident in his tone. We just never knew it. Alicia turned, her expression troubled. That's what I need to understand. Why didn't we know? Why maintain this separation between your professional reality and your relationship with us? Didn't you trust us to appreciate who you really are? The question cut deeper than her siblings' more pragmatic concerns about finances or professional standing. Alicia was asking about authentic connection, about why I had kept a fundamental aspect of my identity hidden from those theoretically closest to me. I gestured for them to sit in the comfortable seating area adjacent to the formal desk. It wasn't about trust, I began carefully. When you were young, the separation was practical, creating stability during a period when my professional responsibilities were intense and often unpredictable. As you grew older, I observed how you were developing your own identities, your own definitions of success. So you didn't want to influence our choices, Marcus suggested. Partly, I acknowledged. But there was something else, something I'm only now fully recognizing myself. I had become so accustomed to compartmentalizing different aspects of my life that integration felt not just unnecessary but somehow threatening. The longer I maintained the separation, the more difficult it became to imagine bringing those worlds together. Alicia nodded slowly. You created different versions of yourself for different contexts. The strategic business leader in this office, the practical, modest mother in our home. Both versions were authentic, I clarified. Just incomplete, when viewed in isolation. But don't you see the irony? Alicia pressed, leaning forward intently. You raised us to value honesty and authenticity above all else. Always be true to yourself was practically your mantra during our teenage years. Yet you were deliberately presenting a partial version of yourself to the people who should have known you most completely. Her words held no accusation, only a genuine attempt to understand a paradox that clearly troubled her. "You're right," I admitted after a moment of reflection. "There is an inherent contradiction there. I encouraged authenticity while practicing, a kind of strategic compartmentalization that prevented you from fully knowing me." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "To be fair, we didn't exactly create an environment that encouraged you to reveal your full capabilities. We were pretty dismissive of your professional insights, assuming they couldn't possibly be relevant to our more sophisticated work." Alicia nodded in acknowledgement. "We inherited Dad's condescension more than we realized." Even I caught myself explaining basic design concepts to you as if you couldn't possibly understand creative strategy, despite your obvious intelligence in other areas. The recognition of their own role in reinforcing my compartmentalization seemed to soften Alicia's confusion about my choices. "So where do we go from here?" she asked simply. "How do we build relationships based on who we actually are, rather than the limited versions we've been presenting to each other?" It was the essential question, the one that looked forward rather than backward, seeking growth rather than assigning blame. "We begin by acknowledging that none of us is defined by a single dimension of our lives," I suggested. "We create space for complexity and evolution, rather than fixed categorizations." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And we stop making assumptions about capabilities based on titles or visible markers of success." A rueful smile crossed his features. "A lesson I'm learning both personally and professionally these days." As our conversation continued, I found myself sharing aspects of my professional journey I had never discussed with my children. The strategic challenges I had navigated, the opportunities I had identified, the satisfaction I had found in building something substantial without requiring public recognition. They listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking insightful questions that revealed they were reconsidering not just their understanding of me, but their own definitions of meaningful achievement. "You know," Alicia said as our conversation drew to a natural close, "growing up, I always felt a bit like the family disappointment for choosing graphic design instead of law or business or medicine. I thought you supported my choice despite believing I was limiting my potential." "Nothing could be further from the truth," I assured her. "Creative work has intrinsic value completely separate from its market compensation. The ability to translate ideas into visual communication that resonates emotionally is a rare and valuable gift." She smiled, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. "I'm beginning to understand that you haven't just been humoring me all these years, that your definition of success is genuinely more nuanced than I realized." As my children prepared to leave, Marcus returning to the integration team meetings, Alicia to her design studio downtown, I felt a profound shift in our family dynamic. The painful decision I had made decades ago to compartmentalize my professional and personal identities had created both opportunities and limitations. Now, the unexpected revelation was catalyzing a more authentic connection based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than assumed limitations or obligatory familial bonds. The path forward wouldn't be without challenges. Decades of perception don't transform overnight. But the foundation was being laid for relationships built on who we actually were, rather than the comfortable but limited roles we had assigned each other. Sometimes the most valuable opportunities emerge not from careful planning, but from disruptions that force us to reconsider our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves, about those closest to us, and about the artificial boundaries we create between different aspects of our lives. The painful decision wasn't about whether to reveal my professional standing or financial position. It was about choosing integration over compartmentalization, complexity over comfortable simplification, authentic connection over strategic distance. As I watched my children depart, I felt a profound sense of possibility, not just for our family relationships, but for how each of us might approach the complex intersections of personal identity, professional achievement, and meaningful connection, moving forward. 3 days after implementing our counter-strategy against the Peterson Group, the results were already becoming apparent. Their legal team had withdrawn the emergency injunction request, recognizing that our restructuring had rendered their original challenge obsolete. Financial analysts were beginning to note the strategic elegance of our revised acquisition framework, with several prominent investment firms upgrading their assessments of Meridian's position. While the professional victory was gratifying, it was the personal transformations unfolding in parallel that occupied my thoughts as I prepared for a rare weekend entirely to myself. My children, for the first time in years, had made no claims on my time. No requests for childcare assistance, no solicitations for financial advice, no obligatory family dinners organized around their convenient schedules. This deliberate distance wasn't hostile. It reflected something more nuanced, a collective recognition that we needed space to recalibrate our understanding of each other before attempting to establish new patterns of interaction. The revelation of my true professional standing and financial position had disrupted decades of established dynamics, requiring thoughtful consideration rather than reflexive adjustment. I decided to use this solitary weekend for something I had postponed for too long: transforming my home environment to more accurately reflect my complete identity rather than the carefully curated image I had maintained for decades. The modest house would remain. I genuinely preferred its comfortable dimensions and familiar neighborhood to the ostentatious estates favored by many of my financial peers. But certain aspects could evolve to accommodate the integration I was now embracing between my professional and personal selves. Saturday morning found me in the rarely used formal dining room, which had served primarily as an obligatory setting for holiday meals rather than a functional daily space. The heavy oak furniture, purchased during my early marriage when Richard and I were emulating conventional success markers, had never truly reflected my aesthetic preferences. I began emptying the china cabinet, carefully wrapping pieces in packing materials. Many of these items held no sentimental value. They were simply the expected accoutrements of middle-class respectability I had maintained long after such considerations ceased to be relevant. They would be donated to a women's shelter that helped displaced families establish new homes. As I worked, my phone rang. Diana, calling despite our agreement to preserve weekends except for genuine emergencies. "Victoria, I apologize for the weekend interruption," she began, her tone conveying genuine reluctance. "James Peterson has requested a private meeting with Meridian's controlling interest, specifically you, not me as CEO. His office called 3 times yesterday." I paused in my packing. Interesting. Did they indicate the purpose? Not explicitly, though his assistant mentioned mutual opportunities beyond current circumstances. My guess is he's recognized the effectiveness of our counter-strategy and is exploring alternative approaches to gain access to TechVantage's technology. Or attempting to identify who he's actually dealing with, I suggested. Peterson has always prided himself on knowing the decision-makers behind corporate structures. Our holding company arrangement may frustrate his usual intelligence methods. That's very possible, Diana agreed. What would you like me to tell his office? I considered the implications carefully. Meeting with Peterson would shift me further into visible leadership, a step I needed to evaluate against my longer-term strategy. Yet refusing could create an unnecessary adversarial dynamic that might complicate future interactions. Schedule. It for Monday morning at the Hamilton, I decided, naming a discreet private club where business discussions could occur without public scrutiny. Breakfast meeting, 7:30 a.m., just Peterson and myself, no additional representatives. Are you sure? Diana asked cautiously. Peterson can be intimidating in one-on-one settings. I smiled at her concern. I've been observing James. Peterson's negotiation tactics for 15 years from the advantageous position of being completely ignored. I doubt he has many surprises left. After finishing the call, I returned to my dining room project with renewed purpose. The heavy furniture was removed by a donation service by mid-afternoon, leaving the space open and full of possibility. I had arranged for a carpenter to visit the following week to discuss converting the formal dining area into a combination library and working space, something I had secretly desired for years, but had deferred as inconsistent with the practical, mother image I had maintained. As evening approached, I took a rare moment of genuine leisure, pouring a glass of excellent Cabernet from a vineyard I had quietly invested in a decade earlier. Sitting in my favorite reading chair, I reviewed the personal portfolio I had maintained, separately from Meridian's corporate holdings, a diversified collection of investments reflecting interests and values I had rarely discussed with others. There were substantial positions in women-led technology startups, sustainable energy innovations, and educational access initiatives across developing markets. These investments reflected priorities beyond mere financial return, a vision for impact that extended beyond quarterly performance metrics. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. Found myself questioning my assessment of a potential client today, based solely on their previous position. Caught the assumption before acting. On it. Small step, but thought you'd appreciate knowing your point is registering. The message made me smile, not just for its content, but for what it represented. Communication based on shared intellectual insight, rather than familial obligation or practical necessity. Rebecca was connecting with me as a thinking partner, rather than merely as her mother. I was composing a response when the doorbell rang, unusual for a Saturday evening. Opening the door revealed Richard, my ex-husband, looking significantly older than when I had last seen him at Marcus's wedding 5 years earlier. His once commanding presence had diminished, his carefully cultivated executive demeanor giving way to the undisguised signs of age and, if I wasn't mistaken, financial strain. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying forced geniality. "May I come in? I was in the neighborhood and thought we might catch up." The transparent falsehood, Richard was never in the neighborhood of anywhere without deliberate purpose, immediately signaled his visit had specific motivation. Nevertheless, basic courtesy prevailed. "Of course," I replied, stepping aside to allow him entry. Though I'm surprised by the unexpected visit after so many years of minimal contact. He entered with the careful assessment of someone noting changes to once familiar territory. His gaze lingered on the empty dining room visible through the entryway. "Redecorating?" he asked, attempting casual conversation. "Realigning my environment with my actual preferences rather than external expectations," I corrected mildly. "Would you like some coffee?" In the kitchen, Richard perched awkwardly on a counter stool, watching as I prepared the French press. His discomfort in this domestic setting was palpable. A man accustomed to executive boardrooms and expense account. Restaurants finding himself in the ordinary surroundings he had abandoned decades earlier. "You're looking well, Victoria," he offered. "Retirement seems to agree with you." I nearly smiled at the irony of his assumption. "I'm not retired, Richard. My professional circumstances have evolved, but I remain actively engaged in my work." "Ah!" He nodded as though this confirmed something. "Yes, that's actually related to why I wanted to speak with you. I've been hearing some rather remarkable rumors recently about your position at Meridian Investments, about Lawrence Blackwell's succession plans." And there it was, the actual purpose behind his sudden appearance after years of minimal interaction. News of my controlling interest in Meridian had clearly reached his social circles, prompting this belated reconnection attempt. "Those aren't rumors," I stated calmly, placing his coffee before him. "They're facts. I control the majority interest in Meridian Investments through a holding company structure established before Lawrence's death. Richard's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise that I had confirmed so directly, calculation of implications, and finally something approaching admiration tinged with regret. "That's extraordinary," he acknowledged. "Though perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. You always had remarkable insight, even back when we were married. I remember how you predicted the technology sector transition years before most analysts recognized the pattern." The acknowledgement, coming decades too late to hold any meaningful value, reflected Richard's consistent pattern: recognition of others' capabilities only when they might serve his interests. "What brings you here after all these years, Richard?" I asked directly. "I doubt it's merely to congratulate me on professional achievements you've only recently discovered." He had the grace to look momentarily abashed before rallying his considerable charm, the same persuasive presence that had once secured major clients and investment partnerships. "You've always appreciated directness," he said, attempting to establish complicity. "The truth is, I've encountered some temporary financial complications. Nothing catastrophic, merely a timing issue with several investments that haven't matured, as projected." "And you thought I might be in a position to help with these timing issues, now that you've learned about my Meridian connection," I concluded for him. He spread his hands in a gesture of candid acknowledgement. "It would be a short-term arrangement, 3 million, perhaps 5 at most. With my connections and your resources, we could structure something mutually beneficial." The proposal was breathtaking in its presumption, approaching a woman he had abandoned decades earlier, whose children he had neglected both emotionally and financially, with a multi-million-dollar funding request based solely on recently discovered financial capacity. "What makes you think I would consider such an arrangement?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. Richard leaned forward, shifting into the persuasive mode that had served him well throughout his career. "We share 3 remarkable children, Victoria. Despite our personal differences, that connection remains. And while our marriage ended, we once built dreams together. Perhaps this is an opportunity to create something positive from that former partnership." The invocation of our children, whom he had consistently failed to support in meaningful ways as leverage for financial assistance, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of my character and values that was almost impressive in its completeness. "Richard," I said calmly, "let me be perfectly clear. I will not be providing financial assistance, whether characterized as a loan, investment, or partnership. My resources are allocated according to carefully considered priorities that align with my values and strategic objectives. Your current financial complications do not meet those criteria." His expression hardened, the charm dissolving into something closer to his authentic nature. "That's remarkably cold, Victoria. After all the history between us, to dismiss my proposal without even considering potential mutual benefits." "I've considered it," I assured him, "and determined that a financial entanglement with someone who has consistently demonstrated poor judgment, ethical flexibility, and disregard for commitments would contradict every principle of sound investment strategy I've developed over 3 decades. Richard's face flushed with the distinctive anger of someone unaccustomed to direct refusal. "You've clearly let this newfound wealth and position affect your perspective. The Victoria I knew understood the importance of maintaining connections, of leveraging relationships for mutual advancement. The Victoria you knew," I replied evenly, "was creating a strategic foundation you never recognized because you were too focused on immediate visibility and personal recognition. The difference now isn't in my fundamental character, but in your belated awareness of capabilities that were always present." As Richard gathered himself to leave, his controlled facade briefly slipped, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. "The children might be interested to know how quickly their mother dismisses family connections when they're inconvenient. How different your values become when you're the one holding financial power. The attempted manipulation, suggesting He might poison my newly evolving relationships with our children, might once have influenced my response. Now it merely confirmed the wisdom of my decision. Our children are adults capable of making their own assessments, I replied calmly. And they've recently had considerable practice reconsidering assumptions about capability, character, and authentic value. I welcome any conversation they might wish to have about tonight's interaction. After Richard departed, I returned to my comfortable chair and temporarily abandoned wine, feeling profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of clear-eyed assessment and boundary establishment. The woman who had once carefully maintained a limited presentation of herself to preserve family harmony and professional advantage had evolved into someone capable of integrating her complete identity, professional acumen, financial discernment, and personal values into consistent, authentic expression. The dining room stood empty, awaiting transformation into a space that would better reflect my actual priorities and daily practices. Similarly, my life had cleared necessary space for authentic realignment, removing outdated furniture, establishing clearer boundaries, and creating room for new possibilities more aligned with my genuine preferences and values. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.